All right, so today we're talking about service workers and specifically how to make them easier to work with by using caching strategies. So we're going to build a service worker here. I've got sort of the framework laid out for it already, but we're going to build it so that it can handle any kind of file that we want, any sort of situation that we want, and do so in a very simple, easy to write way. So I have my web page. We've got an image with a background. We've got some text. I've got fonts coming in. I have a service worker that is registered. It's attached to this page. And I have in the cache, I've got my index.html file. I've got a 404 page. I've got a PNG I'm going to use as kind of a placeholder. My favicon, CSS, JavaScript. That's it. So my external fonts, my external CSS, other things, other images that I load, none of that's in the cache yet. All right, so let's take a look at the setup. Jumping in here. So I'm bringing in a font called MyNerve, another one called Roboto that I could use. I'm not currently using Roboto, but just to show we can bring in these multiple fonts. We've got the pre-connect to both the CSS and the font itself to make our page run a little bit better. CSS, JavaScript, our favicon, and I'm getting that sample image from the Pixum Photos website, so it's a great placeholder website. My JavaScript file is doing nothing other than registering the service worker. So once that's done, we don't really have to think about this file anymore. Now, my service worker, starting off with a few standard things at the top. I've got my version, so as I'm changing my HTML, CSS, JavaScript files, I can increment this, and my service worker will automatically clear out the old version and cache the new versions of all of these files. So that's what cache list is. It's a list of the files that I want to put in the cache at the very beginning when my service worker installs. So we're not going to be really talking about the install and activate event. I've just got some fairly standard script in there. I'm going to add all these files when the service worker gets installed. I create a cache, save all these files, and then when it's activated, I delete the ones that do not match this unique name that includes the version number. Okay, so that aside, those are fairly standard. This is where we're going to focus right here. The fetch event. This is the event that gets triggered every time there's a request coming from the web page for anything. HTML, CSS, a font, a JavaScript file, image, any kind of request that's coming from the web page will pass through this event listener right here, the fetch event. So that means this event is going to give us the request object. This request object gives us pretty much almost all the information that we need to make decisions. Hey, if it's a font, what do you want to do? Hey, if it's CSS, what do you want to do? If it's an HTML file being requested, or if it's fetch for some JSON data, what do you want to do? Are you online? Are you offline? Is this a website file that's coming from your own server, or is it coming from someplace else, some external resource? So we're going to get answers to all those questions and then use that, because inside the fetch, we have one thing that happens, and that is for every single one of these, we have this method, respond with. This EV respond with method is like the return statement for this event. This is, hey, I want to send this response object back to the browser. So based on answering all those questions, what is it that you want to send back to the browser? Could be I'm going to go external, I'm going to fetch the file, bring it back, and pass it over. Maybe I'm only going to go to the cache. Maybe I'm going to do both. Maybe I'm going to update the cache and then send it back. Whatever we're doing, we're going to use this method to send a response object back to the browser. So let's start by getting answers to all these questions. So I'm going to create a whole bunch of variables that I can use in my decision making. Am I currently online? Well, in a service worker, instead of window object, we use self, and then we can check the navigator object reference inside of the service worker and find out. Online will tell us true or false. So if you're online, this will be true. If you're not online, that's going to be false. So there's our first question answered. Then I'm going to create a URL object. I'm going to do this because I don't want to take the request and break it up into a whole bunch of separate things. I don't want to have to deal with a big long string and split it on the slashes and the question marks and the ampersands and all those other things. If I turn it into an object, this EV request, I'm going to be able to deal with each of the pieces of the URL as if they were object properties, because that's exactly what they are. So we'll use this URL and its properties to figure out, is this thing that we're being requested, is it an image? Or is it JSON? Or is it CSS? And so on and so on. So we can figure out all these things from the URL. Now, the various parts of the URL, maybe for an image, like in my HTML, I'm going to the Pick Some Photos website. So if that is part of the host name for the request that's coming from the web page, I know that's the only thing I'm getting from that website. So we can do this. We can say if the URL host name includes Pick Some Photos. If that's the case, I know the thing is going to be an image. Or maybe I'm going to look at the path name for the URL and see if it includes or if it ends with .png or url.pathname.ends with .jpeg. And so on and so on. So there's a whole bunch of different things that you can look at. I'm looking for different types of images, my .ico file, SVG file, and so on. So all those requests can be handled like this. So we look at the properties. For my JSON, maybe I'm going to be getting all of my data from my own website, or maybe I'm going to be getting it from the Random Data API. So that's going to be the host name. That's where all my data is coming from. My CSS, well, that can be if the file that's being requested ends with .css. That could be it. Or maybe the host name is Google APIs because we're getting those fonts. So URL host name includes Google APIs. Let's say the only thing that we're getting from the Google APIs is our CSS for our fonts. And then down for the font, we can say URL host name includes gstatic. Or maybe I've got a local font and it's a WOFF2 font. So path name ends with there we go. So that's that. And HTML files, well, there's a cool thing about them. In the request object, there's a property called mode. Now, we're not allowed to change the mode necessarily ourselves. The browser does the determination. Hey, is this thing a CORS request or a non-CORS request? Or for HTML files, it sets the mode as navigate. So if the ev.request object, if its mode property is equal to navigate, I know that this is an HTML file that's being requested. So we can go on and on. We can look at all the different permutations. These variables will vary a little bit depending on whether or not it is your, or what your website is, what it does, what the files are that your website are going to have. One last one here we'll throw in is external. I want to know, is this something that's coming from my own server or is it coming from someplace else? So we can look at evrequest.mode to see if that's CORS. Maybe that's one way to check it. Or I want to look at the host name to see if the host name for the request is the same as the one, like if this one right here, the host name coming from the request, is that the same as the place where my service worker came from? So let's create a variable for that one as well. We'll say const self URL. So self is the service worker object, so we can get at its location property the same way you normally would with window.location, but we're going to say self.location. And now I can compare those two. I can say, okay, if self URL dot hostname, if that is the same as this one, its host name, so the one that the page was asking for, which could be ours or someplace else. So we'll say url.hostname. So if the two of those are the same, or sorry, are not the same, change that to not the same, then we're external. If the request mode is CORS, that could be another determination if it's external. Okay, so we have all of these variables that we can use now with our caching strategies. So let's quickly, before we write anything more, there's very little actually to write here now. Let's go in and look at these caching strategies. So cache only, cache first, network only, network first, stale while revalidate, network revalidate, and cache. These ones are fairly standard. You'll find them on most websites. The differences are cache only. Okay, I only want to go to the cache. Let's say it's a file that's going to be in the cache. I'm saying it's never going to change, so I always want to get the one from the cache. Make things a little bit more efficient. Cache first. Let's go to the cache, and if it's not there, then we'll try to fetch it. Network only. I don't want to go to the cache. I always want to fetch it. Network first. Try to do a fetch, but if it fails, go look in the cache. Stale while revalidate. I'm going to go to the cache. I'm assuming it's there, but I'm going to get it from the cache, give it back to the browser, but I also want to get a fetch a new copy and put the new copy into the cache. And we can also use that fetch as kind of a fallback in case the cache failed. Network revalidate, sort of the reverse of that. Try to do the fetch. When the fetch is successful, save a copy in the cache, but also, if the fetch fails, return the copy from the cache if it's there. Beyond that, things are going to get fairly specific depending on the website that you're building. So here's just 4 examples that I threw out here. Placeholder image. So maybe I've got a placeholder if something is not going to work out. If there's a specific URL that's being requested, I'm going to use a placeholder instead of it. So we could do that. I can get something from the cache to send back as a placeholder. A 404 page. You've got a 404 page that you want to return under certain circumstances. Maybe you want to pretend that it was a server-side error that happened. So we can do that. We can actually custom build a response object to send back. And again, blah, blah, blah. Just go on, create your own strategy for whatever circumstances you want to deal with. So let's quickly throw the code in for these. Every one of these is going to return a response object. All of these have to return a response object, or our EV respond with, back up in our fetch listener. Inside here, this will only be happy and let things continue to run if what it's getting back from one of these functions is a response object. So caches.match, and you'll see we pass the event, which is going to be our fetch event down here. So ev.request. So whatever the request is, look in the cache for that. Cache first, same idea. Caches.match, we're going to go there with and look for ev.request. But if it fails, so I'm going to have the then, and this is going to be my cache response. Now, if I just wrote this, if I just said return cache response, this is now exactly the same thing as this. I just added a then. So it goes and gets the match. It goes and gets the match. Look at it and return it. It's doing the same thing as this. But here we wanted to check it. So I want to say, I'm going to return that. But if it's not there, I'm going to return fetch EV request. So I will attempt a fetch. So if this is failing, this is what we're going to do. So that's what we're doing. Network only, return fetch EV request. That's the whole thing. That's that whole strategy. Network first, So we're doing the reverse of this. We're going to attempt to do our fetch first, and then we'll have a then that listens. Inside of here, we get our fetch response. But this could be a failure. The fetch response could be a failure. So we're going to check to see if it's okay. So if fetch response.okay, then return our fetch response. If it's not okay, then return from the then, just like we did the return up here. We're going to return the caches.match version. There we are. So you can see these first four, they're pretty simple. Try one thing, try that same thing, but if it doesn't work out, do the opposite, do the fetch or do the cache instead. Stale while revalidate, a little bit more complex, but still pretty close to the same thing as what we were doing. So we're going to try in the cache first. So return caches.match, looking for EV request. Then we're going to have that cache response. Now, I do want to return the cache response. That's ideally what I want to do. But it is possible that that's not going to be in the cache, so I need to have a fallback. So a fetch response that I'm going to do. I need to create this. So we'll say let fetch response equal fetch ev.request. Now this is pretty close to what we had up above. The difference here is that in addition to, like inside of here, we're going to return the fetch response so that it comes down here. So we get a response object and we will return that, return response. Okay, so we're pretty close to what we were doing up here with the cache first. It's pretty much, it's identical to that really. However, we split this up into a separate step with this variable because inside of here, in addition to doing the response, I want to go and update the cache. So I've got a response object. I need to put that into the cache now. So I'll do that. So down here, we're going to return from here caches.open cache name. Then we have our cache. And once I have the cache, I can call put ev.request. And now I have my response object here. But I have a problem. Now this return is never going to run because I've got the one up here. So I'm going to move this up inside of here so that it does actually take the response and return it to here, which returns it to the fetch, which goes into this variable. So I have both of these available. So two different promises here. This one is resolved. This one not resolved yet, but that's okay. We can return a promise that will resolve to a response object. One last problem we have right here. These two lines, I'm using the variable response twice. I can't send a response to two different places. I can't put it in the cache and return it to the browser. It's one file. So we have to actually make a copy of it. So right here, we'll say, hey, clone it. Make a copy of the response that came back from your fetch. So I've got this resolved. Here's my fetch result. I'm going to copy it, and that's what's going to go in the cache. And then the one that came back from my fetch, that's the one that's going to go into here and be ready for this if the cache failed. If the cache didn't fail, that's fine. I'm still running this code. I'm still doing the fetch, getting the copy, putting it into the cache. All right, so that's stale while revalidate. And then we're going to do something very similar, just doing the fetch first right here. But we want to put the result of the fetch into the cache. So we're going to return fetch ev.request .then. And here's my response object. This is my fetch response. Let's call it fetch response just to be clear. So there's the fetch response. Now I do want to put that into the cache, but only if it was successful. So if fetch response.ok, then I'm going to put it into the cache. So we need to do the same thing we did up above. Return caches.open. Open up the one that matches the name that we have at the top of our file, listed at the top of our service worker. Once that's open and we have the cache, now I can call cache.put, just like we did right here. ev.request is the name, and fetch response, we're going to clone that just like we did up above. And now I can return my fetch response. So try to do a fetch. If it works, save it in the cache, and then send this back from the function so that it gets sent back to the browser. But if it didn't work, so if fetch response was not okay, that's when we go to the cache and we try to make a match for the request. Like that. So these two, pretty much the same thing, just doing them in a different order. This one's prioritizing fetch, this one's prioritizing the cache. All right. The last couple of strategies, these little custom ones that I build, placeholder image. Well, I have that 404 image in my cache, so I'll do caches.match and just look for that, the 404.png. That's my placeholder image that I'm going to send back. The one for my HTML 404, same idea, caches.match, and it's the one called 404.html. That's the one I'm sending back. Okay, pretty simple. You can build your own. You can have your own custom files and images and so on. You can be getting things that are, based on whether they're in a specific folder. I'm going to call my specific strategy to return one certain file. And here, one, I'm going to pretend I'm going to build a custom response object. Now you can do this. Return new response. So inside of here, I have to figure out, okay, what is it that I'm going to return? Well, I'm going to return actually just a string, and this is going to be like an HTML file that I'm returning. So I'm building one dynamically right here. And inside the body, I'm going to put an h1 tag, and we'll say server gone crazy. Now, this isn't something I would actually do in production, but this is illustrating the point that I can build a custom response object. And my status, there we go. There is my HTTP status code 555, which is not one that is actually used in the real world. There's a whole bunch of status codes that are not used. So I'm going to do that. And my status text I'm sending back is going to be the same message, server gone crazy. And I'm going to set a header. So inside of here, headers, and I'm going to create one called content type and set it equal to text slash, there we go, if I can write that correctly, text slash HTML. Okay. And then this strategy, I don't have anything in there because that's just custom, whatever you want to build. You can build as many of these functions as you want. So this one is going to return this string as an HTML file. I'm setting the content type as text HTML. So that response, it's like there's an actual HTML file that I'm sending back with this HTTP status code. All right, so all of these strategies are now things that we can call upon back up here inside of our fetch listener. And remember, this is like a return statement for our function. This function right here that's running when the fetch event happens. So I can write if statements like if is online. So if you're online, what do you want to do? If you're offline, what do you want to do? Maybe I'm going to call my fake server error function. So ev respond with, and I'm going to call this fake server error right here. That's the function I'm going to call right here. And I'm going to pass my event down to it so it has the response object in case I wanted to use that for something. But if I'm online, I'm going to call ev respond with, and I'm going to say, let's call the cache first strategy. Pass our event down. There we go. Now my service worker has two possible things. If I'm online, I'll try to go to the cache. If I can't do that, I'll go online, do a fetch. But if I'm offline, I'm going to send back this HTML page that fakes that I'm not working. All right, so let's go here into our application, refresh this so we get our latest service worker and all of our files. Okay, let's unregister this, make sure we clear out all the errors, make sure there's nothing going wrong. Okay, so we've got no errors occurring. These are the files that we have. And if I refresh, oh, we've got some errors happening. Let's take a look at those. Invalid URL, line 37. Oh, yes. It's not EV request, it's EV request URL. There we go. You probably spotted that as I was typing it. And we're just waiting for that. This one is an actual location. This will give us the full href. But here for the request, we have to ask for the URL. Okay, let's update our version just so that we can see that that is happening as well. All right, we'll get rid of the service worker, refresh. Refresh again. There we go, no errors. Everything is working. So there's no problems on our page. Our font is here, our images are showing up, our CSS is being applied. If I go offline and I refresh, I should get that server gone crazy. And there it is. So I'm getting in my network here, there's the 555 error. So that's actually happening. I'm getting a 555 HTTP status code because that's the thing that I sent back. Now, we have this for offline. We could say cache only instead. If you're offline, always go to the cache. So we'll refresh that. There we go. Oh, let's go back online. Refresh this. There we go. So we have the new strategy. We've got the files. Anything that's in here, we should be able to get. There we go. If I go offline, the only thing that's going to fail, yeah, there's a couple of things that are going to fail, things that aren't in my cache, like this image wasn't in the cache. The fonts are not in the cache, but they're in the browser cache, not the cache API, but the browser cache. The browser's still hanging onto those for us. So we have those, but we could change our strategy to say, hey, you know what? If I'm online, this is what I want to do, or this is what I want to do. I want to actually add those things into the cache instead of just going cache first. So that way, when I'm offline and I'm caching only, so let's do that. Unregister. You may as well delete this too. So everything's gone. Let's refresh. There we have it. There's our cache. So here's what we have right now in our cache, and we are online. This is checked. So we are online, and if I refresh this, I should be able to, oh, it's giving me errors. Let's check that I'm online here. Yeah, I'm online here. What's failing? All right, so our fetch event for those fonts was failing. So the fonts and the image were all failing. So we'll check out our network revalidate function. Okay, so we're doing requests here. We're doing a fetch. Oh, something that I didn't mention earlier is we weren't testing up here. I wasn't doing if statements with all these things to check and see if it's an external request. if the mode is CORS or anything like that. So that is something that you have to take into account. If it's a request or something, if it's a request for an image or JSON or something, there may be additional security requirements that you have to get. I'm just throwing one of these up. Typically, I would have a whole bunch of if statements nested inside of here, checking to see, okay, is it an image? Is it HTML? Is it a font? Is it external? Is it internal? All those different things. So let's just do a blanket thing here inside the network revalidate and cache on my fetch, just because I know I'm getting fonts and CSS and images that are coming from external sources. I'm just going to add the settings in here to say, all right, let's set the mode to be CORS, and just to be explicit in case it wasn't set. And let's say credentials are set to omit. So I'm not going to send cookies or anything else with this request. Now, this is I'm using a blanket solution to all my requests. I wouldn't typically do this. I might have something different. Maybe there'd be a different strategy for some external resources, but whatever the case, that's what I'm doing right here. Is I'm just going to say, do this for everything. Don't throw the cookies, or don't add the cookies to the request. Set it as a CORS request all the time. And now let's unregister, make sure we get the latest version of this, refresh. There we go. There's everything. And there we are. There's the image, and here's my CSS, and here's the actual font as CORS requests, and they're coming in here. So they're here. So now, if I go offline and I do cache only, the page still works. And that's it. So that is how you can simplify your life with service workers. Is in your fetch event, just come up with a whole series of Boolean values that describe different conditions. Is it from this domain? Is it from this domain? Is it this kind of file? Is this the file extension? Are you online? Are you offline? Is it CORS? Is it not CORS? All these different things. You can turn those into Boolean variables and then create a whole series of nested if statements. Each one of them needs to have an EV respond with. You don't ever want to have something where you're just writing, if, and then do one EV respond with no else condition. You're opening yourself up to an error if you do that. So always have the else condition for every if, and each one of those having a respond with, and then you come up with the strategies. You pick which strategies you want to use and create as many as you want. So if you want a copy of this code, if you look down in the description, you'll find a link to the GitHub repo that has all of this code. Feel free to use that and experiment, have some fun, and get comfortable with service workers and caching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.